All right, we'll go ahead and get started on our Sharpening the Sword period of class. We had finished James and we were going through that, and Lord willing, next week we'll introduce the book of 1 Peter. I'm excited for that in that study, but we wanted to kind of look at this and take this time in this class. Oh, my fan wasn't on this morning while I was preaching. You got to have it now. But anyway, sometimes, again, when we look at the crucifixion, oftentimes we may look at portraits or pictures and different things, and I'm guilty myself of kind of having this kind of thought in my mind, and I'm not really, it's not really based on anything, perhaps maybe just a description or a picture maybe that I had seen. But I think it's very good when we look at the crucifixion in the sense of I think it helps us to understand exactly what Christ did for us. When we read in the New Testament, when we're looking at the gospel accounts, oftentimes they say, and they crucified him. And that's it. That's all that the text says, just says, and they crucified him. So we think, well, what all went on? What all happened during this crucifixion? And hopefully, I don't think it's anything, the pictures are too graphic, I don't think, but again, the kids are gone at that, so some of it may be a little bit graphic, I guess, for you, but I think we'll be all right as we go through this. So what's interesting as we look at this is that that the crucifixion, as I stated in the worship hour, was not designed for Christ. The Romans didn't look at that and say, look, we've got Christ, he says he's the Son of God, he's doing all of these things, let's figure out a way to kill him. And I said, well, let's make this cross. The cross was, in fact, going on several years before this. And the Romans, though, they had kind of, if you want to say that, they had kind of perfected it. That's a horrible way to say it. But as we made the point in class this morning, the purpose of the cross was humiliation and torture and then ultimately death. So that's what the cross is. And again, I find it interesting. I'm not saying you're wrong in doing it, so don't take that. But when we wear the cross, I mean, again, this is a torture device, so kind of interesting in that sense. But again, if you like that, that's fine. I'm not speaking against that. But it's, again, when we look at this cross, so its origins are going to be found as early as the ancient Egyptian time. But typically we think of it like impaling. That's a little hard to see, probably, and especially if you're towards the back. But if you can see, and again, as always, if you want any of this, if you want to flip back through this, just let me know, and I'll get it for you. But perhaps you can see this pole, this image. It's probably harder towards the very back. But essentially, these are two men right here, and they're sticking this individual on this pole kind of through the rib cage is what they're doing. These individuals probably were dead or dying, and they impaled the individual and then set them on the pole or set them up on the pole if the pole was already existing. But this was a very common occurrence in days gone by. What we find is that Egyptians, there's some writings that lean to this idea of them impaling individuals. But even through the ancient Assyrian, the Babylonian, and the Persian empires, we begin to see, and what this is, what this relief is if you're familiar, I know I've spoke about it before, but if you are reminded of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, he's the one that went against Jerusalem where Hezekiah has to pray. They're shut up in Jerusalem. It says that he's got him shut up like a bird in a cage because Lachish, the city that they had just conquered, this is what they were doing to individuals. They were impaling these victims, and again, that makes that story, or that account, it's not a story, that makes that account even more powerful when we think of Hezekiah. I'm in Jerusalem, this army that is known for impaling people, he's coming knocking on my door. What does Hezekiah do? He prays to God, and that's a great account there, where the angel comes in and destroys all those Assyrian soldiers. But nonetheless, this is kind of the precursor to the crucifixion, is the impalement. Now, it seemed to be that in ancient times that they would hang you up after you had died. That seemed to be the ticket rather than a source of killing you, but they would kill you or find you dead on the battlefield, and they would impale you where people could see you. So let's notice this account right here. For those who were present in the Deuteronomy class, you might be reminded of this. The law states in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22, and if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree. Now this is interesting, and again we notice in 23, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land may not be defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So Paul talks about this, the idea that whoever is hanged on a tree is accursed of God because Christ was hung on a tree. Now, if you're like me, grew up watching Westerns, when I look at hung on a tree, I typically think of, Clint Eastwood, Hang 'em High, something like that they were hung. When I think of a hanging, that's what I think of. But actually, when you look at the original language with this, it is actually this tala, you'll see there, that's the transliteral of the Hebrew, is to hang up someone on wood or a stake. So what was happening in this time is that they were doing this. They were hanging individuals on these stakes. Again, you can see that referenced in Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23. Again, this is Strong's definition of this word tala, is that it was not a means of punishment, but someone that had already been killed. Now notice in the reference down here at the bottom, it might even mean to hang up part of the body of someone. Now if you go to 2 Samuel 4:12, you might be reminded that when Saul and his sons were killed on the battlefield, they hung their bodies up. So that would be the same way, right? Hanging this on this pole as kind of, here's what we have achieved. So it's very, very crude, but that's the way it was. But again, not hanging from a rope in as much as hanging maybe impaled or nailed or tied to some way to this pole. Now here's something interesting as well that I found. When you go to Esther's account, I know there are many who are fans of the book of Esther. When you look at this, and we might remember Mordecai, Haman was going to try to destroy Mordecai, and he builds these things. Notice in verse 23, and when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree. Now this is the people that were going to rebel against the king. Again, this hanged is this Hebrew word tala, on a tree, this hetis. All right? So again, not hanging from a rope, but hung on a pole. This is what they were going to do. Now again, Persia was known to impale. Persia was in practice of this, and Artaxerxes, or Ahasuerus, however you want to pronounce him, he was the king of Persia, right? He was those individuals coming in. So when we see this was commonplace that they would be doing this. Now what's interesting is, when you read Esther 5:14, that Haman says, let me build the gallows. Now these gallows, again, when I think about gallows, again, I think of the Westerns. They build the platform with the hangman's noose, the gallows. But the gallows here in Hebrew is this hetis, the tree. So they had built these poles. Haman had built these poles. And when you go back into the text, he had built them so tall. And essentially what he's going to do, he's going to put Mordecai's dead body up there on display. Again, 50 cubits. Right there, right? 50 cubits high was what he was going to build. He erected this pole to hang him on. But again, we see, he says, until that King Mordecai may be hanged, tala, right? And it says, the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows, hetis, to be made. So this was a common practice. Again, we think of the old Wild West, hang them by the noose, right? String them in the tree, kind of hanging. But really, in the biblical text, this impalement, this hanging on a tree, was a little bit further back than we may have realized in that. But the interesting little tidbit I thought myself when I was studying all this. Now, what we're going to look at, for those who may be saying, well, what about Judas, right? He hanged himself, interestingly enough. Matthew chapter 27, verse 5, and he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went out and hanged himself. The Greek word, again, because the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, the New Testament is written in Greek, you have this Greek word, means to choke or to strangle oneself off to death, hang himself. And when you go and read the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, so the Greek translation of the Hebrew, when you read that in Esther 8:7 about hanging him, it is not to choke or to strangle oneself, but to cause to hang on a tree. Again, referencing Deuteronomy 21:22, Esther 8:7. So this Greek word, there's two different Greek words here. What Judas did was hang himself, strangle himself, like we would think the old Wild West style of hanging. And in Esther, the Septuagint translates that correctly in that they were hung up on a tree. So pretty interesting with that. All right. So now let's get into some of these pictures here. Again, I don't think they're too graphic with this. I think most of us have probably seen these. But typically, when we see this, typically many individuals begin to look at the cross like very similar to this. The stakes would be through the palms of the hand, and then the stake through the foot may be overlapped like that. And typically that's the way we have the cross depicted. Now, let me say this going into this. I'm not saying that this is how Christ was crucified. I'm just giving you the ways in which individuals were crucified, and one of them may be the way Christ was. But we see pictures or maybe similar to this. Again, we see the nails through the palm of the hands, and then the feet. Now this is an interesting one. If you can see this little platform where the feet are hanging or sitting on, that's important. And we'll make a reference to that here in just a minute. But many of us have seen probably a cross with a little step down here at the bottom with his feet nailed to that. So we kind of want to, again, that's kind of the images I've probably seen and probably many of you have seen as well. And we think, okay, well, that's how Christ was crucified. But really, this is a little bit more accurate to the way some of those individuals had died. The important part to look, not so much being tied at the top, because we do know Christ was nailed, but the position of the feet to the pole is very, very important. When we're talking about this, the way an individual might have been crucified was that way. So the Romans, they're going to perfect. Let me look. All right, let me get to this, and then we'll get into the scourging. But the Romans are going to be the ones. This is a again, through the evidence of what was written and the evidence of what has been found, this is kind of like what would be common. Now again, I'm not saying Christ died like this, but this would be a common way a criminal would be crucified on the cross. Now the Romans, again, they're going to do this, but what's interesting, and we talked about that in class, the Romans had a class system, so the upper crust of the Roman people, we were talking about the death of the apostles, and Paul was a Roman citizen. He was kind of affluent in that, so he had the option of being beheaded. So that was why he was not crucified. He was beheaded, I would imagine, because the crucifixion was not really intended for Roman citizens, but they were more for the lower class and non-citizens. They would be convicted of murder and things like that. They would be crucified. And again, they crucified a lot of people. Josephus, in his accounts, talk about when they were capturing Jerusalem, the Romans, they ran out of trees to hang these individuals on because they crucified that many people. So again, this was a very common occurrence. So typically in the process, all right, so say you're in Rome in the first century, you're condemned to be crucified. Well, what was up against you, right? What were you about to endure? Well, you would be flogged. That would be the first thing. There would be a centurion that would be in charge of this, and then they would gather some soldiers that would be just in the regular army, and they would be what they would fix to do, they would strip you down and scourge you. All right, so we've probably seen, again, pictures, things like this depicted. From what I can gather, more than likely it looked more like this. I'll give you another. This is a Roman flagrum, is the way that is described. But you can see we've heard it before, the bones and the metal and things like that. Some people call this the cat of nine tails. There's another one in a minute they call the cat of nine tails. I'm not sure which one it is, but I had a historian teach a class, and that's what he said more than likely it was this. So having a wooden handle, this rope, and what would happen is this scourging that they take your clothes off your back, many having the robes and things, they would take all that off of you and tie you either to a post or a rock or something to stretch the back out, and then they would begin to just stripe you. Now, Jewish law, if you were whipped, again, the 40 minus 1, but the Romans didn't have any government on them, right? They could whip you just as much as they wanted to. And in fact, I think history kind of tells that many of the Roman soldiers tried to kill you during the scourging. They were kind of taking pride in that they could beat your back, again, ripping the flesh and getting down to the bone and even to the organs. They kind of took pride, and it's a sick way of thinking of it. But that's what they did. If they could kill a man by scourging him, and that's what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to be easy about this. So they would scourge you in that. And that would be, again, you would be led out, draped over this an object, and that ran across your back. Now, this is also what they would call a Roman flagrum. And you can see maybe through that these little metal pieces down at the end. Again, a wooden stake with leather strips. I don't know. Many people don't think that was what was used. That might have been for different types of punishment. But perhaps it was. But when you go to 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 11, when Rehoboam and them, you might be reminded, it says, "My fathers whipped you with whips. I'll whip you with scorpions." The scorpion would be something similar to this, and it would actually have hooks in that metal piece, right? It would have a hook in the end, and when, obviously, we can understand when that get across your back, the hooks ripping everything in its path. So if you ever hear of a scorpion, that's kind of what they were talking about. We think of that scorpion with that tail, with that hook. So don't know that Christ was beaten with one of those, but again, that is typically called cat of nine tails, so could just as easily have been what Christ was used in his scourging. And again, many people, the soldiers would try to kill them with the scourging. No government on how many stripes you get. But again, it was public humiliation. So now, once I have been beaten, right, my back exposed with all that, the sores and everything, and again, going pretty much from the base of the head to your tailbone would be exposed, would be opened up. Then you would be led through the street. Again, we know that they put a purple robe on Christ, and they put his raiment. They took that off right after they had beat him. And I don't know about y'all if you've ever had a good cut, and you kind of pull that material off. It hurts pretty bad again. So you can imagine your back being laid open, lay the purple robe on you, bleeding through that, take that off, and you know they didn't do it gently. Putting his raiment back on, but it was customary that these individuals would be left nude to be paraded through the street. That was part of the humiliation. I've been beaten. I'm going on like that. Now, you'll notice in this depiction, this individual carrying this crossbeam, that seems to be more, that lines up very much with a lot of the historical accounts that they did not carry the entirety of the cross, so the upper beam and that top beam, but they would carry the beam that they would be nailed to. And again, the purpose was to get you to the cross to kill you. So they didn't really want to kill you. They wanted to get you kind of right to that point, But again, some of the Romans wanted to kill you in the scourging, but they kind of tried to get you right there. But they might have to compel someone to carry that for you. So again, we hear Simon. He's going to carry the cross for Christ. That way, Christ is able to be tortured with the cross. But the whole thing, the whole beam and everything would have been about 400 pounds. But typically, they carried that upright post. That's what they would do. Now, over to the side, again, we're going to get back to this little shelf right here in just a moment. But this right here was typical for the crosses. They would either set the beam on top of the one post, or they would affix it to the post. Either way would be sufficient. But I've always wondered if Christ, because they drug you up there with ladders and pulleys, so now my back is exposed, right? It's ripped, and drug up that post. Now, it wasn't nice and smooth like this table finished. A rough cut of wood drug up that process to the cross, right? They would nail them to that and go on, and they would raise them up to this. So very brutal way, but that's how they intended to do it, right? They wanted you up there, and they wanted you on that pole. Now, these would be the spikes that they would use to put in your hand. I think they actually have dug this up. So kind of get an idea of what it would look like. Not a very thick spike, but thick enough, kind of a broad head on it, and they would typically have a point. Obviously, that's been broken off there in that picture. But they would take these spikes, and this is what they would affix you to the tree with, or the pole. So this is a little bit graphic image, but this right here is just the viewpoint. So don't think of that as something other than that. But you can see the stake and what it would look like. Now again, many of us, We've seen the pictures of the spike through the palm, and you've probably heard lessons on this, but that just won't hold the weight of the individual. So you can feel that. There's a nerve right down there in your wrist. There's like two of those nerves. I can't remember what they call it. I think they call it on here median nerve, right kind of through your wrist. And that's where they would put it, right? It would hang you. The Greek word goes from the fingertip to the kind of in the elbow area for a hand. So when he says he was nails through the hand, it could have been this area right here. But many people, you can kind of see the cutout. Again, that's the view, the cutout going through all of that, affixing your hand. They would have a piece of wood as kind of like a washer, and they would nail that into your wrist. So you've been beaten, you've been scourged, you've been paraded through the street, humiliated. You're toting this beam. You get there, they lay you out. The nails go into your hand, right, to your wrist area. And that is to support the body. Now here's where we get at. Now here's kind of what we're getting at. What would happen is the cross was designed to asphyxiate you, right? You would have trouble breathing. You were not able to take a breath. So you can see the individual would have to push up on the stake that would be in your foot and pull up with your wrist, and you would pull up to take a breath and catch your breath and inhale and exhale. Now, the reason I said to think about that post was if you wanted an individual to last longer on the cross, you would have to push up with your foot. So if you had them a little step down there to put their weight upon, that was actually a bad thing, because what it was doing is that was just prolonging. And again, many people would lay on the cross for 2 or 3 days. So Christ died, I believe it was in 6 hours, is all that he was on the cross. But people would stay there for days. So what would happen is you'd pull yourself up. Again, the pain from the nails going through your wrist, sliding your back against that pole, the pressure being put. Now again, when you think about your foot being fixed to the side, right, going through your heel bone, pushing up on that stake to catch a breath, eventually you would die, right? You would just asphyxiate. Your lungs couldn't carry out anymore. So that was the purpose. That's what they wanted you to see. They wanted you to be strangling, in a sense, dying, not being able to catch your breath. And again, it was a very prolonged way of torture. They wanted you there. They wanted you to hang there. So there's various different ways in which they would place the body. Again, you kind of see them bent like this. The more awkward, the better. I think Josephus would write as well that the Roman soldiers, when they were destroying Jerusalem, they just kind of tried different positions to see which one was the worst. Very, very inhumane. But to think about our Savior. So when you read accounts like, I love to read Luke's account when Jesus is in the garden and he's praying, and the sweat is like drops of blood because he knows what's fixing to happen to him. This is what was fixing to happen to him. He says, I'm fixing to get scourged. They plait the crown of thorns. They place it on his head. They spit on him. They beat him. They mock him. They lead him through the town. They get him up here, and they crucify him this way. And he's hanging there, right, for hours. Now, again, you haven't been listening to me almost an hour hanging there for that long. But that's what they would do. Now notice this. Again, kind of going back to that. So you can kind of see the depiction in the palms, going back to those pictures. Probably wasn't there. May have been through the foot here, but again, supporting that weight, it seemed better to put it through the side. I'm going to show you that here in just a moment. Again, kind of going back with that step. That would prolong it, because then you could push against that step instead of the pressure on your heels. You could push against that, so that would actually prolong your death even more if you had that little platform there. But here's a good example of what kind of looks like. This is a bone that was found. They didn't really do coffins, a casket, but there's like a bone box is essentially what it was, of a very high society, someone high in a high class of society. They would have these bone boxes, but you can see this nail through this heel bone. So that's essentially what was going on. So again, we know that that's how they crucified individuals, that you see the wooden washer or plank on this side, your foot, they would be, to the side of the pole, your leg bent up in whatever way, and they would nail that through your heel into it. And again, the washer was designed so your foot wouldn't slip off and you fall from the cross. The reason that nail is still in there is when it went into that beam, it hit a knot, and it kind of hooked that spike is what they believe is what happened. And they couldn't get the spike out, so they just cut his foot off. Which he was dead, but nonetheless. So that kind of gives us a grisly look at what exactly it meant. So when we talk about the cross, right, we see these images and things like that. Again, here's that. You know, again, looking at the way that nail and that board would be right here, right? Affixing your leg to that pole like that. So when we think about what Christ did for us, right? We think, oh, he died on the cross. But this is what he endured, right? Some things like this. All right, so that's the end of that. Again, we'll sing a song here in just a moment. But anyway, the cross, and you can do some research on this. Now, again, I'm not saying that Christ died like this individual with his ankle bones pierced through. We do know that he had a hole through his feet. We know there were holes through his hands, and he was cut on the side. Oh, I'm glad I thought about that. I made that comment in the worship hour. If you're having to push up to get your breath, right? You're continually pushing up with your legs, catching your breath, pulling up, catching, like that. That's why they broke their legs, is so they wouldn't push up. So essentially, he would hang there and die even quicker. So when you read the gospel accounts, and they say the Sabbath was coming, they had to get the bodies down, so they were kind of trying to hurry the process up. That's why they would go through and take a hammer or a big mallet. They would break your legs up here against this pole, so that way you were unable to push up. And because you were unable to push up, eventually it would so much pressure on your lungs, you would just die. You asphyxiate that way. So that's what happened. But we know Christ was already dead. They put the spear through his side. Water and blood came out. So that he didn't have his legs broken in that sense. But anyway, nonetheless, that's what Christ went through for you. He went through that for me. And as compelling as it is, when the Hebrews writer talks about that when we go back into sin, right, when we've been baptized and we put on Christ and we go back into sin, it says you crucify him afresh. See, Christ did all of that so I could get to heaven. And if I mock that and say, well, I don't care that he went through all that, or if I obey the gospel and then I turn back into the world, it's like I'm doing that all over again to him. He's having to go through that. So very, very, very compelling to me. It helps me. We have about 5 minutes. Are there any questions maybe about some of that? Or a slide you'd like to see? Yeah. Miss Rhonda asked a good question. On the impalement, I think it could go either way. I think there was a time when they used it as the way of dying, and they would stick it into you. As graphic as this sounds, they would put the stake and place you on it alive, and gravity obviously pushing that stake through you, killing you that way. But sometimes they would run them in, sit them up. But sometimes, if they were already dead, they would just hang you up on it or tie you up to it. I don't know if that answered your question. It just depended on the impalement of who was doing it and what they were doing. Like when Joshua was killing the kings, they were dead, and he hung them on the pole. I don't know if he just impaled them and hung them there, or if he tied them to the tree, but they were hung on that pole. They were already dead. But eventually it got to where they said, we'll just do it to them alive, hang them on this pole, and it go through them. I may be wrong in that. I thought it was the Jews. I'll have to go back and look. Okay, yeah, okay. I don't know. I'll go back and try to look at that. Yeah, I was thinking that because I think it was because the Pharisees in their self-righteousness, they would do the save one, right? Just in case we miscounted, we're going to give you 40 lashes with that cat o' nine tails, but we're so holy, we'll save one just in case we miscount. So that was kind of their hypocrisy in that. But I'll check on that, but that may be right, Ms. Rhonda. Anybody else? All right. Again, that impaling, I can't imagine Hezekiah, right? And kind of leaning on that in the minute or two we have left. That was a kind of a psychological thing that if I'm coming to your town to, you better surrender or we're going to do this to you. So that was kind of part of what went on with that, was if you see your family members, again, kind of like what Ms. Rhonda's asking, either impaled or sat on these poles, it would be quite intimidating. Anybody have anything else? All right, very good. All right, hopefully that wasn't too graphic for you, but I think it's worth looking and noticing those things and understanding exactly what Christ did for us. Because again, when you read the New Testament, it just says they crucified him. But there's a lot more going on than just that. So John will come and lead us